May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, the Bible is brilliant at expressing what it's like to journey with God. For example, listen to Yahweh speaking through the prophet Hosea. When Israel was a child, I loved him. I taught him to walk and took him up in my arms like a father lifting an infant to his cheek. I bent down to him and I fed him. And though Israel is bent on turning away from me, how can I give him up? My compassion grows warm and tender, and I will return my people to their homes, for I am the Holy One in their midst. The parent-child imagery is unmistakable here, and as all families recognize, over time, the linkage between generations flexes and grows. The same is true of life with Yahweh. As young Israel progresses, God's self-giving adjusts to their changing needs. Inevitably, this flexing shifts the partnership onto a new footing. And then young Israel must catch up with the new thing God is doing, which resulted from the new thing Israel is doing. The dance goes on. This morning we cut in on a glorious step, the dedication of the magnificent new temple in Jerusalem. The giant limestone blocks glisten in the sun. Trumpets blare and choristers trill. The temple courts and gates brim with Jews from every tribe in the nation of Israel. All eyes are riveted on King Solomon as he strides forward to speak. But before we listen in, there is something we need to know. Earlier in Israel's life, this scene never could have happened. Back then, when Israel was very young, the Hebrews lived as 12 separate tribes of desert nomads. Moses had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, clambered up Mount Sinai to receive God's commandments for them, and led them to the threshold of the Promised Land. From there, they fanned out on their own, each clan to its own territory. Each dedicated its own shrine for worshiping Yahweh and elected its own judge for settling disputes. In this simpler, earlier stage of Israel's development, relationships were personal and direct, and it was perfectly natural to pray to God as the ruler of one's own tribe. Well, fast forward a few generations, and roaming Israelites began noticing scouts from nearby empires sent out to claim their homeland. The 12 tribes armed themselves helter-skelter to defend their way of life. But local militias proved no match for disciplined imperial troops. And so the Israelites cried out to Yahweh, "Give us a king like the other nations." From their lips to God's ears. This would change everything. A royal court would erect a royal capital, and with time all eyes would turn from the countryside to Jerusalem. No more prayer meetings under a tent. No more sacred storytelling around the campfire. God's people would come to think of themselves as the king's people. And so King Solomon steps forward to speak. His task is to help young Israel imagine something more for themselves, to mentally shift their grassroots partnerships with Yahweh onto this new imperial footing. Knowing that many minds are still offended by leaving behind the prayer tent and the sacred campfire, Solomon boldly raises his hands and prays. Will God indeed dwell here on this earth? Even heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this temple that I have built. But, O God, let your eyes be open night and day toward this house of prayer, this place of which you said, my name shall be there. Hear the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. O here in heaven, your dwelling place. Heed and forgive. With God's unprecedented blessing, the majestic new temple would be replacing the old tent and campfire as Israel's place of meeting God. Solomon's prayer indeed carried the day, and Israel rallied around Jerusalem. This accomplishment might have been enough, really, yet the king imagined more. He foresaw a time when God's chosen people would shine like a light that enlightened surrounding Gentiles and turned old mortal enemies into new spiritual allies. Afire with Israel's fresh calling, Solomon stretched out his arms and prayed on. And when any foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a distant land because of your name and prays toward this temple, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all that the foreigner calls you, so that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, and know that your name has been evoked on this house that I have built. At the time he prayed over the new temple, what Solomon imagined was only a pipe dream. In fact, in coming centuries, these same empires overran the Holy Land, and Roman flunkies came to occupy the palace itself and usurp worship at the temple. Yahweh now must again shift gears to meet the people where they are. God sends a latter-day scion of Solomon's family, Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps you've heard of him, to serve as a new kind of king for Jews of a new day. Jesus takes his good news out on the road, meets people where they are, and teaches about a kingdom not of this world. The peace he promises passes all understanding, and his power knows no bounds. Jesus even offers immortality, a way out of the death of all human dreams. Many of his followers find this prospect totally unimaginable, and they walk out on him. But the inner 12, led by Peter, make the leap of faith to catch up with what God is doing now. Lord, whom else can we follow? Peter pleads in today's gospel. We have come to believe and know that you are the Holy One of Israel. The rest, as they say, is history. Following the resurrection, Jesus' followers fan out around the Mediterranean, and with time, even the Roman emperor becomes a Christian. Though barbarians overrun the empire, the Pope rallies the church to regroup and go on mission to a damp, gray island they refer to as the end of the world, and we refer to as Great Britain. A new branch of the faith takes root, sporting a bit of an Irish brogue, and sends new shoots to the new world, where it spreads from sea to shining sea. And not the least of its fruit is a lively Episcopal congregation nestled at the foot of the Issaquah Alps. Imagine more, Moses had urged the slaves, trudging towards the Holy Land. Imagine more, Solomon had pressed the crowd at the temple dedication that day. Imagine more, Jesus had prodded his followers as others were falling away. We serve a God who is determined that we will remember how when Israel was a child, I loved him. I taught him to walk and took him up in my arms like a father lifting an infant to his cheek. I bent down to him and fed him. And though Israel is bent on turning away from me, how can I give him up? My compassion grows warm and tender, and I will return my people to their homes, for I am the Holy One in their midst. Amen.